Our text this morning comes from Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth, or at least what we understand to be 1 Corinthians. And Corinth was a city in Greece that was famous, or maybe infamous, for its wealth without culture and abuse of the poor. What a reputation, huh? And Paul, on one of his missionary journeys, made quite an impact on that city, somewhere around the year 50 in the Common Era. And he helped establish a church there in Corinth, and he stayed there for a little over a year, helping them grow and nurturing them along until he finally took off north to Ephesus, where he would establish another church. And so somewhere around either 53 or 54 CE, Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthian church. And apparently it wasn't his first letter either, because as you read through this, you realize he refers to another letter that he wrote to them earlier. But we understand this passage that Terry read is from what we call 1 Corinthians. And what stands out in this letter is how Paul tries so hard to get this church to establish a healthier sense of community. We get the impression as we read this letter that the church in Corinth, or at least the people in it, had all sorts of communication issues. They thought a little too highly of themselves. And they had a hard time welcoming people into their fellowship who weren't like them. And, they were kind of snobby if you really get right down to it. And so one of the illustrations that Paul used to help them understand what it means to be more welcoming and to be a better church who welcomes others is right here in this passage that Terry read. Paul said that the church is the body of Christ. And this isn't the only time he's used this illustration either. He refers to the body of Christ in Galatians, he refers to it in Romans, and also Ephesians. But he just spells it out best here in this passage from 1 Corinthians. So then what does it take to be a member of the body of Christ? Well, you can't be self-serving. You've got to learn to work well with others in the body of Christ too. You can't think that you're the most important member of the body, but at the same time, you mustn't think that you're the least important either. You've got to be faithful. You've got to be hopeful, and you've got to do all things in the spirit of love. But just who gets to be a member of the body of Christ? Well, who's in? Who's out? That's what we're going to talk about this morning. Because in case you haven't figured it out, not everybody who attends church is necessarily a member of the church in the strictest definition of the word, right? Once upon a time, church membership was a big deal. To say that, well, I'm on the membership rolls of such and such church, that was something. That was kind of a status thing. It said something about your denominational affiliation. Oh, I'm Presbyterian or I'm Methodist. It said something about your status in the community. It could be like, ooh, he's an Episcopalian, or, oh, those snake-handling Pentecostals, It said something about your temperament even, maybe, or maybe what your political leanings are. It definitely gave you a vote when it came to important decisions in the life of the church. It helped when tax time rolled down and you're itemizing your deductions. Sometimes it opened up opportunity for college scholarship for your kids. It gave you some credibility if you were running for political office. And it gave you a guaranteed place to be married and buried, even if you only showed up to worship once or twice a year. That was membership. It was just the thing to do. Now, of course, that all changed as culture shifted and considered some of the institutions that used to be trustworthy all of a sudden not so much anymore. The postmodern era came along, and that postmodern era was the beginning of the end of the mainline denominational church. Some folks say that this happened somewhere around 1968 or a couple of years before or a couple of years after that, however you want to work it. And even though the evangelical megachurches experienced a surge in numbers during that time, once that novelty of being the anti-establishment church wore off, they're in decline too. So don't feel bad. And some people said that this was the end of the Christian era. I mean, notice in the beginning I was talking about 54 CE, common era, not Christian era anymore. That's what the historians started saying. But, some people might have said, well, that declaration that Nietzsche made in the 19th century finally came true. Maybe God is dead. But just like the bumper sticker said, well, no, Nietzsche's dead, but God's still alive. And we know that. We understand that in the church, that God is alive and well, because we see God at work every day. We see God at work in the lives of people, in the lives of just observations of creation around us. God is not dead. We see God alive and work every day. So I don't think we've lost our faith in God so much as we have lost faith in the church. And I say this because since the 1960s, the number of people who identify with a specific church or a specific faith tradition or a body of believers is declining. There is a growing number who mark none when asked to identify with a particular church on a census or a survey. Or if the opportunity presents itself for a fill in the blank, they will write spiritual but not religious. Call them nuns. Or we could call them SBNRs, spiritual but not religious. Whatever you want to call them, it is clear that although they maintain a belief in a higher power, or even identify with a particular broader faith tradition, they sure as heck don't want to have anything to do with the church. And so I wonder, were there nuns or SBNRs back in first century Corinth? The term Christian, you've got to understand, this was the infancy of the church. And even the term Christian was a slang term, kind of a derogatory slang term for those who followed Jesus. But I wonder how those that we nowadays we call them seekers would have been treated in the church at Corinth. And, I'm talking about those folks who may have been intrigued with Jesus and Jesus' teachings, but just weren't ready to sign on the dotted line. People who were interested in following Jesus, but didn't particularly want to be a member of one of these communities of faith. Maybe they were practicing Jews who were loyal to their tradition, but, they resonated more with Jesus's more love than law philosophy than they were their own tradition. Or maybe they were patriotic citizens of the Roman Empire whose pagan ideals weren't filling that spiritual void that was in their hearts. Would they have been considered SBNRs, spiritual but not religious? Given the choice between Jewish, Christian, and pagan, would they have written none, check none on their little census box? I don't know. See, in our culture today, we see a lot of SBNRs, and quite honestly, we don't know what to do with them at all. Churches, aren't even very patient with them because we're like, listen, make up your mind. You're either with us or you're not. You're either hot or cold, just like it says in the book of Revelation. And that means you're lukewarm. And that means God's going to spit you out. Which, by the way, that's not what that passage is about at all. But that's a sermon for another day. But that's what they say. That's what these folks say who have no patience with the SBNRs. And a lot of churches today think, well, then why do we have to change to cater to these nuns? Because what do they have to offer to the church? What do they contribute to the life and fellowship of this church? If they don't like us, it's their problem, not ours. And you know what's sad? Is I can resonate with that a little bit. A few years ago, Lillian Daniel wrote this famous article for the Huffington Post called "Spiritual but Not Religious. Please Don't Bore Me." And she writes about how much she just hates sitting next to SBNRs on airplanes. Because inevitably they're going to ask her, oh, what do you do for a living? And depending on how truthful she feels that day, she's like, I'm a pastor. And then all of a sudden, these SBNRs unload all of their angst about the church on this poor woman. She says that they talk about how they find God in the sunsets or on long walks on the beaches or in mountains. And she writes, like people who go to church don't see God in the sunset? Like we're these monastic little hermits who never leave the church building? Oh, how lucky we are to have these geniuses inform us that God is in nature. As if we don't hear this from the Psalms or the creation stories and throughout the depth of our tradition. And she goes on to say, being privately spiritual but not religious just doesn't interest me. There is nothing challenging about having deep thoughts all by oneself. What is interesting is doing this work in community, where other people might call you on your stuff, or heaven forbid, disagree with you. Where life with God gets rich and provocative is when you dig deeply into a tradition that you did not invent all for yourself. She concludes by writing, can I switch seats now and sit next to somebody who has been shaped by a mighty cloud of witnesses instead? Can I spend my time talking to someone brave enough to encounter God in real human community? Because when this flight gets choppy, that's who I want by my side, holding my hand, saying a prayer, and simply putting up with me, just like we try to do in church. I think Lillian may have snapped a little when she wrote this article.
It's been a long flight.
And my guess is she's had several of those long flights too. I feel for her. You know, somebody asked me what I do on a plane, and I'm like, I'm a metaphysical engineer. And you know, like I say, when I read her article, part of me is right there saying, booyah. You tell him, Lillian, because even though I didn't come to faith until my late teens, I still had the benefit of spending the important formative years of my early faith journey in the fellowship of the church. Mind you, I had a lot of problems with the church that I suppose relate to Paul's illustration of the church as a body, because I've encountered my share of folks in the body of Christ who lean towards the south posterior end of the body. But I have to acknowledge that even those parts are necessary for the church to function properly. They are needed, just as they are needed in the human body for it to work. But every now and then I run into an appendix or a tonsil. Someone whose purpose in the body is vague, unclear. Yeah. The body seems to do well with or without them, but there are occasions when disease or cancer invades, and the church has to do some divine surgery or divine intervention in order to continue living. But honestly, I appreciate the church. I do. I appreciate the rich variety of traditions, old and new. But I am not ready to chastise or dismiss these SBNRs and nuns quite yet, Because part of me resonates with them too. Because remember, I am in the ministry myself because I have a problem with the church. And my mentor, when I first came to faith, said, "All right then, Jesse, go do something about it." Now, Derek Penwell, he's somebody that I went to seminary with back at Emmanuel, and he is now the publisher of the Demergent online magazine. And it's actually a disciple magazine online. And he has a little more sympathy for these SBNRs, because he understands that there is a spiritual void in many of us that longs to be filled. And that when we feel that void, we try to do things to fill that hole. He understands that many of these people reject the church because to them the church represents all the bad or negative aspects of religion. Corruption and hypocrisy, prejudice and exclusion, politics and conformity to values that may not have anything to do with Jesus at all, more to do with culture than Christ. Penwell understands that the church could be a wonderful place for these seekers to build a faith with a solid foundation on Christ. But he also recognizes that quite often the church is just not ready or spiritually mature enough to bring these people into fellowship. In fact, Penwell says, I would honestly rather deal with someone who is spiritual but not religious than someone who is religious but not spiritual.